And welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs, the UK's original free market think tank. I'm Andy Mayer, the Chief Operating Officer of this august institution. And tonight we're delighted to be hosting a panel discussion on Plan A+, creating a prosperous post-Brexit UK. And you will see copies on your seats. It's not only a cracking read on the UK's possible options for leaving the EU while advancing prosperity, but it has become a symbol of free expression, as possibly the only think tank publication in British history to be banned and then unbanned by a regulator after we resisted their unwarranted extension into our affairs and freedom of expression. If you are here from the Charity Commission tonight, you are very welcome. We are otherwise delighted to be joined by four esteemed guests this evening. First, and well known to many of you, is the author of the publication, also read in Tarko, but this author is Shankar Singham. Shanker is the director of the IEA's International Trade and Competition Unit, CEO of Competition, one of the world's leading trade and competition lawyers. He's worked on the privatisation of the UK electricity market and the transition of post-Soviet economies. He's worked on the accession of Poland and Hungary to the EU and China and Russia and to the WTO. He has, and I hope I'm not breaking any confidences here, Shankar, he's been advising Harry and Meghan on how to leave the royal family based on Plan A+. That's right, he created a sophisticated suite of options combining Meghan's desire for unilateral settlement, Harry's for ongoing bilateralism, number 10s for a plurilateral way of paying for their security, and a multilateral view that whatever else happened, Prince Andrew should not be removed from the royal sanctions list. And after all that sophistication, obviously we've ended up with a straightforward calendar model. Thank you, Shankar. Next to speak, Professor Jeremy Clements, the Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration and International Business Management at Leeds University Business School. He is President-elect of the Academy of International Business and has a PhD in economics awarded by the University of Reading. He's a noted global expert on the determinants of foreign direct investment, particularly in China, but I was most drawn to what his biography says about his rise within the AIB. His strategy as leader of their UK chapter was to improve membership communications, raise the chapter's profile internationally, form a union with the Republic of Ireland, then focus ruthlessly on R&D to attract researchers from around the world. It's a sort of global Britain strategy with no hard border that has enabled him to take over the world. So congratulations on your ascension in February.
It worked.
Brilliant. Dr. Holger Hestermeyer is Reader in International Dispute Resolution at King's College London, previously a Special Advisor to the Lords EU Committee. Holger is the author of numerous academic papers, including the 2016 publication How Brexit Will Happen. This was an analysis of the then pending issues of constitutional law ahead, noting in a typically understated fashion that, quote, the difficulties ahead are illustrated by the efforts undertaken by the government to build up the bureaucracy, which is surely a test of impending state failure that should become a maxim of this institute. Although on the other side of the debate to Shanker today, I should note on March the 22nd, 2018, Holger wrote a tweet thread where he said, I actually agree with one of Shankar Singham's points. This was in an article written by Shanker for Politico entitled, Theresa May could be the Churchill of our time. Surely one of the best and pithiest expressions I've ever seen of the economic sentiment, scenarios are not forecasts. I do not believe it was the headline Holger was agreeing with, but perhaps he will confirm, and perhaps we will see if that spirit of agreeableness persists through this debate. Finally, I'm delighted that proceedings will be wrapped up by Steve Baker, who has been the Conservative MP for Wickham since 2010. He's the current chair of the European Research Group. He served as Minister in the Department for Exiting the European Union from mid-2017 to mid-2018. Steve is a long-standing friend of the IEA and one of those rare breed of libertarian politicians who try to apply their principles when in government. For those of you who still don't know Steve or his impact on this debate, it is said that on January the 31st, when Marc Francois scales the exterior of the Elizabeth Tower with mallet in hand to bong Big Ben for Brexit, he will arrive exhausted, only to find Steve Baker already there, fresh as a daisy, with a bigger hammer. So, without further ado, I'd like to invite each guest to give their opening remarks, 5 minutes each, before we open to the floor for questions. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get this Plan A+ meeting done. Shankar Singham.
Yes, so there are a number of dates that you'll see here. This version of Plan A+ has September 2019 on it, but the original Plan A+ was September 2018. And what we have not done with this version of Plan A+ is sort of bring it up to date to exactly what's happening today. Having said that, though, when I had a look over it, and this is a reflection, I think, on how perhaps we haven't made a lot of progress since September 2018, that most, if not all, of the recommendations in it and the themes that are discussed in it are still the same themes that we're discussing today. So with that, the only exception to that really is the material on the Northern Ireland, the Irish border, which obviously we have a Northern Ireland protocol now as part of the withdrawal agreement, and we'll have a trade negotiation going forth, the EU-UK trade negotiation, which will include that Northern Ireland element. Although I will say, while we're on the Northern Ireland border, we did recommend in September 2018 a all-Ireland common SPS area, which obviously we now have. In terms of the key elements of this Plan A Plus, they are still the same, and they're still the same issues, I think, as we struggled with in September 2018. Just to take you back to that date, that was just after the Chequers agreement, and the Chequers agreement is what caused the now Prime Minister Boris Johnson, then Foreign Secretary Johnson, and the Brexit Secretary David Davis to resign government. The purpose of Plan A Plus at that time was to think about an alternative plan to the Chequers plan. Our view was the most important thing for the UK leaving the European Union was the preservation of an independent, a real executable independent trade policy and an independent regulatory policy, and how we could achieve those things. The problem with the Chequers agreement is it limited because of the customs union elements of it and the high regulatory alignment elements of it. It limited the ability of the UK to execute those that agenda. So what we instead talked about is what is an independent trade policy for the UK, what is an independent domestic regulatory policy, and let's reverse engineer from that what a UK EU agreement should look like. And so we built this trade policy on 4 pillars. We talk about what we do unilaterally, bilaterally, plurilaterally, multilaterally in the Plan A Plus. None of that has changed. Pretty much all of those recommendations are still the recommendations I would have today. I think the government of the day seems to have embraced them a little bit more than the previous administration, than the May administration. And we also made very clear in this that if you're going to do that, you cannot continue to bifurcate your European trade negotiations and your European trade policy from your rest of world trade policy. You need to have a single mind over all of the trade negotiations. And you also need to do this concurrently. You can't, it's a big danger to have the EU negotiations separately and to wait until the EU negotiation is completed before you start to negotiate with other countries. That's partly a leverage issue, obviously. You want to have lots of other irons in the fire, you want to have negotiations moving forward in order to bring your external leverage to bear on the EU. But it's also because a lot of those things are important in and of themselves, and it's really important, obviously, that we are able to give clear signals on what our domestic regulatory settings are actually going to be. Pro-competitive regulation at home will give significant benefits to the UK economy. We talk about trade deals a lot, and trade deals are important, but what you do with your domestic regulatory economy and how you improve your domestic regulatory economy can give you a much bigger economic gain. So we need to keep focused on all of that. Within the bilateral pillar, we talked obviously about the US deal, we talked about a UK deal, we suggested a UK free trade agreement, what we call free trade agreement plus, essentially best-in-class comprehensive free trade agreement, and that's basically what I think that is the direction of travel of the UK government, at least. We'll see how the EU responds to the UK's proposals, assuming the UK makes them in March. We also talked about a couple of other things. We talked about the potential accession to the comprehensive and progressive the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I think that's still a very important element of UK trade policy. The Japanese, the Australians and others certainly want the UK to accede to CPTPP. We are talking now, at least the UK government is talking now, about a Japan bilateral agreement. It's important to note that Japan gave a number of agricultural concessions in the CPTPP on the basis that the US would be part of it. So the Japanese are therefore more interested in our accession to CPTPP than a bilateral. The argument in the government seems to be that the Japanese bilateral is important. We can do more in the Japan bilateral than the EU did in its bilateral with Japan, and that's probably true. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the CPTPP is a platform agreement. It's a significant, and I would argue, one of the most advanced platform agreements around, and I think that's something we need to be building on. In the multilateral world, we talked a lot about the WTO, our taking up our WTO seat, negotiating the so-called tariff rate quotas, which are the agricultural quotas that are part of our schedules in the WTO. That debate, astonishingly, from September 2018, has not changed at all. We're still having the same debate in the WTO, except that next week we're going to leave the European Union, and we will be in a transition period, but we will be taking up our seat in the WTO. And there are a lot of ongoing things, not just our own modification of our schedules in the WTO that have to be considered, but also what are we going to do in terms of the plurilateral agreements going forward in the WTO, the e-commerce working group, the trade and services agreement, and so forth. And so we made recommendations then, almost a year and a half ago, that are the same as the recommendations I would make now. And finally, we didn't spend a great deal of time on this, but it's in the news, so I'll mention it in closing. I wanted actually at the time, I didn't have time to really do it at the time, we were under a bit of time pressure, but I wanted to have a more extensive treatment of civil service reform and the need to get our institutions able to support the kind of broad-ranging trade negotiation and regulatory thinking that we would have to embark on, and we made the point that we're not really fit for purpose. We have a lot of very good, very bright, very young civil servants who are generalists, who've been trained to be generalists, and actually what you need for this exercise is very experienced specialists in these areas, and that is going to require considerable changes to how the UK civil service operates, and obviously that process is going forward. So I'll stop there, Andy, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from the audience.
Thank you, Shanker.
Hello there. So I must apologise for my voice, but I'm enjoying the second cold so far in January. So if I crash, I hope you'll understand. So I read this with great interest. In fact, I think that the Chancellor of the Exchequer's comments in the FT were actually much more close to the general direction here of the not pursuing the necessity, or in fact diverging from regulatory alignment with the EU. So I think there's actually, in a sense, I think your document has become more relevant. I certainly welcome it because it does, as we've heard, organise the way that we think about the relations of the UK with the rest of the world globally, and not, as Shanker has said, bifurcated, just looking at the EU primarily, and then the rest of the world as an add-on. Having said that, of course, the European Union is the single biggest trading partner for the United Kingdom, and it's particularly important in a whole number of sectors. So I think that I would say that I think that we have to look at it from business perspective, and this is what I really want to say, so I don't want to challenge too much what we have in the document. I think it's a very scholarly sort of setting out of what the options are. But I'm a professor of international business, and that means to say that I study firms first, and I look then for the impact of policy upon the firms. One thing that international business teaches us is that firms have choices. They can export, they can produce overseas directly, we say by foreign direct investment, or they can contract overseas, that's offshore outsourcing. It means at any one time firms can decide where they locate production. So it's very important because we talk mainly about trade in Plan A. And firms are actually making dynamically choices. They're also making choices if they're startup firms, whether they internationalize in the first place, to go international. So big firms, of course, are already international. They decide where they locate production. And so I think that what I'm looking for in the document is perhaps more of an understanding or perhaps a willingness to engage in the idea that policy interacts with firms, and that is very important for the well-being and indeed from the GDP of the United Kingdom. And the reason is this, because if firms decide, as they have competence to do so, that barriers mean to say that they have to they have to take production from the UK to another, to the European Union, then that means to say that GDP is lost from the United Kingdom. And actually, if you think about it that way, that's really, for me, as an economist, that's really where I am coming from. I'm looking at the GDP of the UK. I realise that, of course, we're talking about the trade-off of sovereignty versus sovereignty and security. And with that, of course, we hope that there will be eventually some sort of a payback. But all the theory that tells me is that the United Kingdom may find itself at a disadvantage in terms of the decisions that its firms make. And that means to say that rather than just having trade policy, we have to think about how firms are likely to react. I remember some years ago chairing a meeting room of some 20 trade lawyers. I was a co-chair with a trade lawyer, and about an hour into the meeting in this meeting in Geneva, one of the trade lawyers cracked, and I think he didn't actually stand up, but it was like he stood up, and he said, "But why are we talking about the law? We should be talking about the effect on firms." And then he sank back down into his chair, and because clearly there wasn't the appetite. We were talking about bilateral investment treaties as it happened. So let me just perhaps explore with what's left of my voice to how trade policy can influence the firm's decisions. So if you don't have, it's particularly important in services, which is of course very important for the United Kingdom, vis-a-vis especially the European Union, is to have regulatory alignment. And the reason for that is because you have to have a level playing field. As soon as you don't have a level playing field, you don't have regulatory alignment, the tendency is for firms to walk their production to where the market is. The same is true of products, merchandise trade, where it's important that regulations are aligned so that you can export into that market. So cross-border service trade, which you deal with very logically within the WTO, the GATT sort of approach. In merchandise trade, same is true where you have to have, where harmonization is necessary, a lot of regulation. Where it's necessary to abide by the regulations, production is would tend to walk from the United Kingdom to, in our case, the European Union, the single market. So I think the problem that I face is that I don't have a theoretical model, and this is, of course, is a big problem of why this is going to work out in a good way for British GDP. That's the thing ultimately that I'm really concerned with. I'm also a little bit concerned about the matter of our ability to negotiate. It puts me in mind of Mr. Spock. Does anybody know what that game was, the three-dimensional chess? Well, it's actually four-dimensional chess, where you have to play on four 4 chessboards at the same time. If anybody can tell me that name of the game, I'd be delighted, because I just can't remember it. Can you remember it?
I think it was just called three-dimensional chess. Really.
Yeah, maybe there was a special name, I think. But anyway, that's it. I think I've got to my 5 minutes, haven't I, Andy?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, and I think I have to start disagreeing with Shanker. Of course, I think he significantly underrepresents his impact. I'm busy writing impact studies, so that many of the policies that the report lobbied for have actually been implemented. So I do think there was quite a bit in the report that is now out of date. So let me quickly hash over the starting point, because I think there's no point in returning to the past. The withdrawal agreement clearly is not ratified, but I think there's no one here who seriously has any doubts that it will be. So the withdrawal agreement is done. The trade continuity programs, Shanker expressed some doubts whether the EU would allow negotiation. Clearly has allowed negotiation, was not contested, and the trade continuity program has been quite successful. A lot of deals of the EU, FTAs, were closely replicated. Some weren't. Japan didn't want to replicate it. And some agreements, where they include regulatory parts, could not be replicated. The EEA agreement clearly could not be replicated, and the Switzerland agreement. So they are substantially different agreements now. The future relationship, I don't think a customs union is seriously contemplated by anyone, nor is membership in the EEA. Negotiations of new FTAs, some have already happening. Australia, New Zealand, and the CPTPP. I think the Japan agreement is actually part of the continuity program, which also explains the emphasis on that. And then the threats that you said, potential threats of the US to the multilateral system, those have also materialized, unfortunately. The appellate body is now currently gone. And then there are, of course, a couple of other details. The US Competition Initiative, MFP, they've modified. I think the EU is now on board. At least it's been turned into an ICN model, and all of the EU members in the ICN, the head is currently the president of the Bundeskartellamt, have engaged with that. So, no need to go into that. Also, as Brexit is done, I think let's not rehash those debates, and rather learn for what's going to happen now. And I wouldn't be a lawyer and an academic if I would agree with everything in the report. I disagree with fair bits. I think some of them are wrong. But I think one thing that I find really important that is absent, and I would like to fill that gap, is the procedural bit. Because one thing that is really important coming forward is how will we form our trade policy? So the report is clear blue sky thinking about what can it be, but the reality needs to form it, and some of it I find contradictory. For example, the CPP was formed originally as a project against China. It's unlikely that CPP and China simultaneously makes a lot of sense. At the same time, of course, US and China simultaneously is, if you look at what happened with NAFTA 2.0, where they put a clause in that they dislike these negotiations, that's also not going to happen. So there will have to be choices. How do we have to build those choices? How should we go about them? And I think the first one is we need to be inclusive and representative. We need to build consensus on the type of regulation we want, because a lot of the choices we face are regulatory choices. And the report simplifies, as a lobbying report should, into behind the border barriers. But when you think of regulation, yes, there is clearly protective regulation. Think of Buy America, US regulation that's clearly only protective. But then most regulation has historic reasons, even if it's a barrier. Think of, for example, the UK separation of barristers and solicitors. Is that a trade barrier? Yes, it is. But there's a historic reason for that separation. What about a language requirement for doctors to be able to speak English? That makes eminent sense, one would say, for the health system. It's an enormous trade barrier. Think of China imposing that same thing. That closes the market for almost all UK doctors. No services there. And so on and so forth. And most regulations are dual, and people legitimately disagree about what is the barrier part and what is not. States are notoriously poor at having regulation that is not a little bit of barrier, because it goes through Parliament, and you need to please your constituency, and your constituency never sits abroad. So you put in a bit of protective regulation. But in the end, this will be about a democratic choice. So whatever regulation it is that we want, we should openly address it and advocate for it. Whether it's SPS and the famous chlorine chicken, whether it's hormone beef, there's nothing bad about openly saying what you want. That's the first one. And then we have to build public consensus behind a certain policy. We need stakeholder meetings. We need public consultations. There were public consultations, but the results could be published far better and far more extensively. We need an economic impact assessment of all of the various policy choices we have so that people know what they will do and can then make an informed choice. And there's often a payoff involved. What is the regulation you want? Are you willing to pay the price? The complexity is quite astonishing. So, for example, the extraterritorial effect, even of regulation that's not supposed to have extraterritorial effect, is astonishing. For a long time, car standards were set in California. Why? They were the highest standards. Everyone just tried to comply with them. Now it's called the Brussels effect, and some regulations like REACH, whether we like them or not, have been reproduced, and it's important to speak with industry and see whether industry wants to be in there and replicate that system. And if they don't, well, what's the alternative? And to model those effects. And I think there will be disagreement about who to speak with, but I think it needs to be broad to have the best information available. Our policy needs to be made transparently. We need to know what the goals for trade agreements are. And then it's also about democratic accountability. What is the role of Parliament in all of this? I personally like the US model, where Parliament, or rather Congress, of course, is deeply, or used to be, deeply involved in trade policy making, because that attaches the policy to the electorate. We might not want that, but again, we should be open about that. What is the involvement of the devolved administrations? And there again, I'm slightly worried at the current state of affairs. If we want the union to be strong, we need to include them. And then, only then, can we develop consistent policies on, for example, state aid, where we're currently vaccinating. And the traditional UK position was restricted. We need to restrict state aid. But now I see suddenly all of these articles about how we need to be more generous and break free from the EU system. That seems to be against what the UK stood for. Some policies are unrealistic, and this we can possibly debate later on. Broad mutual recognition of rules. Mutual recognition of rules really only exists in two systems. Between Australia and New Zealand, where they actually drift towards harmonization now with the single market they are building, and within the EU, where it's based on the ECJ, so that can't be replicated either. And finally, on strategy, we need to decide what strategy we want. Do we want to align with the US? Much of the report seemed to go towards alignment with the US, embracing their IP standards, even though they're terribly restrictive of business and actually anti-competitive. Or do we want to build our own models, in which case negotiating with the US, or starting with that, would be counterproductive, and we should go with New Zealand and smaller countries where we can build alliances around creative new solutions and find more likely allies to actually embrace new solutions, rather than the two, actually there's three large hegemons of trade, the US, the EU and China, which are unmovable objects to a lot of respects. The US is proud to never have changed its laws after trade agreements, even though some minor changes were at times made.
Thank you very much. Steve.
Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating discussion. Now, I want to begin by saying thank you for that anecdote about going up Big Ben. Now, at the risk of disappointing my supporters, I don't actually feel very triumphant, not least because I represent a Remain-leaning area and I've had a chastening experience in the general election. But actually, I feel somewhat of a melancholy. Wellington wrote, "Believe me, nothing." That said, "Believe me, nothing except a battle lost is half so melancholy as a battle won." The journey by which we've got here in the history of our country is not a desirable one. This is not how we should have got to where we are. and I and others feel, I think quite profoundly, the burden of the complexity which has been outlined before us. So, to Shankar Singham, I was reflecting as I came to prepare for today on this document and its genesis. I mean, I hope Shankar won't mind me reminding you that on CapEx there's still an article, "A Brexiteer reluctantly for Remain." And, you know, Shankar understood the complexity, Sajid Javid understood the complexity. I think if I were to paraphrase his Daily Mail article, he said we should never have joined, or we should have left long ago, one or the other. But now we're in, we must stay, because it's too hard to leave. So I'm very clear that this is a complex and difficult, and yes, risky thing we've chosen to do. But despite every warning, despite every terror, the British public just voted to give a historic fourth general election mandate to the Conservative Party with an incredible 80-seat majority to get this thing done, despite every terror. So the British people do want to make their own laws in their own country and have their parliamentarians accountable to them for it. It has profound implications for political economy. That's another story, that's another talk for another day. So, Shankar, congratulations on Plan A+, because it brings us clarity, it brings us clear direction, and as has been said, very clearly some of it is being implemented. I hope you won't mind also that I went back to the Legatum Special Trade Commission. I'm not going to name the Special Trade Commissioners, but I do fondly remember the first time I chaired the ERG, chairing a meeting of some of your trade commissioners who'd come over. And it's partly because of who they are, who they were, who they are, that there was so much credibility behind your trade tools for the 21st century, your blueprint for UK trade policy. You know, the people supporting Shanker in the background, some of whom are not able to be very high profile, they're not small figures in international trade. So as somebody who confesses freely, you know, I'm an aerospace and software engineer who got into politics and has particularly strong views about political economy, it really meant a lot to me to sit in that room, and when we discussed could NAFTA be renegotiated, we were discussing it with relevant experts who had done these trade negotiations from Mexico, the United States and Canada. So, Shankar, I really want to congratulate you on that, and all your work on Prosperity UK's border solution for Northern Ireland. I mean, it's tremendous stuff. Just one other thing before I move on. I thought, well, what were we saying before the referendum? Because it's often said they had no idea what they wanted to do. If you think that, perhaps I should say it to the camera, if you think that, please Google Change or Go PDF, and you will find on the amazing Brexit Central website the 1,030-page document which set out where we thought we were going. And there's really rather a lot on trade in there, and it's actually quite a good read, and I think it's not at all inconsistent with what Shanker's saying, although of course what Shanker's saying is rather more developed in terms of where we should go in future. So that's the first thing, and I've used up most of my time. Huge thank you to Shankar. The second thing is, well, what are we doing? Well, it's in the manifesto. It's surprising how rarely manifestos are read, but the manifesto says we want to get 80% of our trade under free trade agreements within 3 years. That is, of course, ambitious. That we're going to have in parallel EU, US, Australia, New Zealand, and very importantly, negotiations with Japan all going together. I have to say DIT is a very impressive department. I'm just really looking forward to discovering that we can keep that manifesto commitment. We should be, I think, acceding to CPTPP, but there's a question about bilaterals first or second. I think the government's policy is going to be bilaterals first. There is, of course, the issue of engaging more with the Commonwealth, and people ought not to sneer at that. We're just in the midst of having a fantastically successful Africa summit. The whole world, humanity needs Africa to emerge into prosperity, the rule of law, decent governance, all the good things that make for prosperity. And we need, of course, it's in the interest of the world that we open up trade and services, create a new platform financial services agreement, of which more in the Q&A with, because I'm going to run over. Andy, I'm sorry. So I'm absolutely clear that what the manifesto says. I think it's consistent with Plan A+, and we simply must now deliver on it. The third point I want to make is there's some past errors we've just got to leave behind. So, I mean, I put 15 on my website and in the Telegraph. We've got to maintain collective responsibility with no more fireworks from the Cabinet. Well, I think that problem's been solved. Parliament's got to stand firm. Well, again, I think that problem's been solved. No more messing about with humble addresses. Parliament needs to avoid chopping the knees off the government when they're negotiating. We need to engage our global allies. I I've been party to engaging the USA, and my goodness, they want to be with us, as do the Australians and as do Japan, as far as I can see. We need to remember to be on the other side of the table from the EU. I think we're institutionally used to being subordinate to the Commission and taking what they say as an instruction. But we need to remember to be on the other side of the table, a separate and equal nation. However difficult this may be, however scary, we're now negotiating with them, not taking their instructions. And I think the final point where I want to stop is we just need to be absolutely clear what we're doing. No, we're not going to have a customs union. We took the single customs territory out of the future relationship, the political declaration on the future relationship. And while we might choose not to diverge for a while, no, we're not going to be following along. We're not going to accept an obligation to automatically, as an obligation in treaty law, accept EU law as it develops. No, we're not going to do that because we've left the European Union, and the whole point was to be outside their legal order and outside their project of political integration, and no, we're not going to do it. That's the choice the public have made and reconfirmed now about 3 times. So, yes, we are going to be a free trading, open and liberal democracy. We're going to be a beacon to the world. But my goodness, we have got a lot of work to do. But with strength and with courage, with high quality intellectual thought, and yes, with constructive criticism as well, but it does need to be constructive, which it has been, I'm not criticising, then we can get this thing done. But we should none of us be under any illusions. We're changing the structure of power in the world. I'll say that again. We are changing the structure of power in the world. We're making it more horizontal, we're making it more accountable, and I believe we're making it more fit for life in the 21st century, where the cost of distance is collapsing and people want more control over their own lives. And however scared I might be inside in my darker moments, I am very, very proud that it is the United Kingdom which is doing this despite every impediment.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to all our speakers. We are now going to change the structure of power in the room. I'm not going to exercise chair's prerogative as we run a little bit over in time. So can I see some excellent questions from the floor, please? Yes, sir. Say your name, please.
Sorry, hold on.
Kentacificalis, localism 2.0. Two things. Number one, when everybody's talking about if there is a customs barrier erected between the UK and the EU, then manufacturers will go to will move to the EU to do the manufacturing. But the thing is, what about the other side of the coin, the stuff that right now British are buying from the EU, which would become more expensive if that same trade barrier is erected? What would happen to that? Will the UK buy from other countries, or will some of the EU manufacturers move their production facilities to the UK to avoid that trade barrier? So far, I haven't heard really almost nobody talking about it. And on a kind of like a tag-along small idea, one of the things that people are afraid to lose now is this scheme where non-EU companies come to the UK to use it as a gateway to the EU's market. But I think there's an interesting possibility if the UK negotiates much lower trade barriers with the rest of the world, it might become the gateway for the EU companies to move to the UK from the EU as a gateway to the rest of the world market.
I see Steve itching to answer.
Yeah, I'll just make a short point. I'm not going to begin to try and gainsay Jeremy on the factors leading to FDI, but I just wanted to say this to you in response, is that it's been a great privilege to meet so many people, and I'm not going to pretend that this is a scientific account. But what I've discovered is if you ask UK or European senior executives, in the short run, would you like the UK to leave the customs union? Of course they say no. But if you perhaps ask them, or rather ask their global bosses, do you think the European Union is heading in the right direction to where you want to be in 5, 10, 15 or 20 years, you get a very different answer. Now, of course, we've got general elections to win, and we've got prosperity and to care about, we've got public services to pay for, and that's all got to be done in the short run. But somewhere in the midst of all of that, if people want long-term thinking from politicians, which they say they do, if they want strategic thought, then actually we've got to find a way as a nation, and the Chancellor will have to do some of it in the budget, to marry the short and the long run, and to ask firms to stay with us in the short run as we leave the customs union, in order to be with us in the long run when we ought to be changing the world to better match where they think it ought to be, which isn't to say we're slaves of corporate executives, but when you're talking to the people who produce, I just do say to you that I've had those two different categories of answer, depending on timescale and scope of their responsibilities.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, and I sort of agree with Steve there. I mean, the balance of whether we be a net gainer or a net loser, it has to be, just like any impact assessment, it has to be done on the basis of some statistical inquiry, econometric work. And that would be very detailed, and actually that sort of evaluation hasn't been done. It should be done, it should have been done, but it hasn't been done to put the firms at the centre of the decision making in response to the sorts of policy changes that you mentioned. But I think that from what we know of the location, the smaller market is more likely to lose rather than a larger market. And whether we like it or not, the EU, the single market, which as old European, I shouldn't say old European friend of mine, an old friend of mine who rose a long way in the European Commission said, but Jeremy, the internal market is a British creation. And it was. This means that, in effect, the British creation, unfortunately, when we diverge from it, and I've no doubt that we will, it will be something that is not so accessible to us. And from what I know, and I don't speak to as many people in business as Steve does, but the point is that what I do know is that many manufacturers of specialist products are silently moving their production, whether it's their own production or contract production, from the UK to the continent of Europe. Now that's obviously the one direction. The other one is interesting, but I don't have a theory to tell you that actually is likely to dominate. And from what my understanding is, it's probably not likely to dominate, and that the UK would probably lose, and that's my concern, GDP. But Steve also picked up on the fact that talking to business is very important. Now, the Institute of Exporters, of course, would rather be aligned with the single market, and these are firms that export from the United Kingdom. Largely speaking to the European Union as well as around the rest of the world. And they would like to be aligned with the European Union. They'd probably like to be, in fact the majority, I think the last survey of the Institute of Exporters said they'd like to be in the European Economic Area. Well, that's not going to happen. But the point is, yes, they are concerned. And these aren't necessarily the global firms, the big corporates. These are independent, these are small and medium-sized firms as well. And if this is what they see as being in their interests, then I see a divergence. So I'd be particularly interested in those of you in the audience who are from the business community as to what your perspective is. I'm sure you'll express your views.
Going to move to the next question. I saw Professor Kamal, then Jonathan Isby.
Thank you very much. Sai Kamal, Director of Research here at the IEA. When the EU is negotiating amongst themselves and the institutions the Services Directive, the whole debate about mutual recognition versus harmonisation or regulatory alignment came up, and clearly harmonisation won. When the EU and US were negotiating TTIP, the whole debate came up again, and the negotiations were on the basis of regulatory alignment and harmonisation. Now, I am very much in favour of, I think many people, when they read Planning Plus, like the idea of mutual recognition. But given what Holger said in his comments, how realistic do you think it is if the UK holds out and says, mutual recognition? Is it actually that the opposition to that will fall down pretty quickly if we're determined that we want the discussions to be on the basis of mutual recognition versus harmonisation and regulatory alignment? Or do you think, I'd be interested in the debate basically between Holger and Shanker on this, that really it's unrealistic to expect that? We would like to think that we could achieve mutual recognition and then be a beacon for the rest of the world in other agreements. But how realistic do you think that is?
Yeah. Well, if I can just, and it sort of picks up the previous question as well in terms, because this is the heart of the whole thing. I mean, this is where most of the time and attention will be. If I can put it in the context of level playing field, which Jeremy mentioned earlier on. So when the EU talks about level playing field, if we can sort of get under the hood on what that means. So we're talking about 4 different things. One is the EU doesn't want to have a situation where the UK is essentially subsidising or giving government benefits and privileges to its companies to gain trade advantage. I don't think there's any appetite in this particular UK government to do that. You might hear MPs say things about failing companies, but broadly speaking, the idea of a UK set of state aid disciplines or anti-subsidy disciplines is not one that is going to be difficult for the UK government to embrace, and to give the assurance that we're not going to do that, and we can build that into a trade agreement. We can build anti-dumping subsidies chapters into that trade agreement. I don't think that will be a problem. Labour and environment, there's again no appetite, I think, in this government to derogate from existing treaties that we are signatories to in labour and environment, or even to derogate from labour rules and environmental rules to seek trade advantage, which is the language that most countries will have in their agreements. So that is covered. Then you have the big problem, which is if the EU's position is going to be you must harmonise in order harmonisation for market access, that's going to be a big problem. And I think that's where the EU is a bit of an outlier, because most other trading partners, most other WTO members, we're building on an international trade construct that is, admittedly, we're trying to do more in this agreement than in other agreements because, A, obviously there's a very strong relationship here, but also because we have a starting point of regulatory identicality. So what can we do with that starting point? But if you look at the history of this evolution from WTO disciplines, the SPS agreement talking about essentially as long as countries have the same regulatory objectives, they objectively achieve them, they should recognise each other where they can. And recognition is in 3 dimensions. It's basically underlying product market regulation, it is standards, and it is conformity assessments or testing. The last area is much easier to do, admittedly. The other 2 areas are much more difficult to do. But I think the UK proposal to the EU ought to be based on an ambitious view of recognition, adequacy, equivalence, whatever you want to call it. And in response to, no doubt, the EU's resistance to it, is to say, look, you have done this underlying product market regulation in some areas. You've done it in the New Zealand EU veterinary agreement, you've done it in bits of CETA, you've done it in bits of the EU-Japan agreement, and the notion that we ought to, in terms of regulation, what we ought to be trying to aspire to, I think, is a good regulatory practices chapter that builds in things like impact assessments that Holger talked about, not only in terms of business compliance, costs and transparency and all those other things, but also effect on trade, effect on competition in the market. Use the work that the OECD competition assessment and regulatory toolkit, the work of the ICM that you mentioned, we should be able to put all that together in a chapter on good regulatory practice and recognition that advances the ball on international trade, what we've done so far in international trade. And that would be very good for firms and business, because the underlying issue here is, why would you not want to harmonise? You don't want to harmonise because regulatory competition is a useful thing. If we're all going to harmonise to what is always going to be a pro-competitive regulatory standard, then fine, let's all harmonise. But that is very rarely what actually happens when you harmonise. You deprive the market of that regulatory competition, and you're much less likely to arrive at a pro-competitive outcome. And so that is why the Australians and New Zealanders, who, if there was ever a case for having a single customs union and single market, they opted for a different approach. Because I think they recognise the importance of regulatory competition. So I think it is possible. We will not know unless we actually make a proposal. And if we get 60% of it, 40% of it, that's at least an advance on where we are. But the problem is there's no other way of doing this, because what are we going to align to if we're going to align? Because EU regulation is moving, and I would argue it's moving in an anti-competitive and prescriptive direction. And so what are we going to align to? Are we going to align to a reference point of now? Well, then we're going to need recognition and everything else when it changes. So we're going to have to deal with this issue in some way. We need, and it is where all the battle is going to be. So we need to have that discussion, immediately.
So this is where I disagree on the fundamentals. I think, first of all, the EU is not an outlier in not granting across the board mutual recognition of rules because there are only two systems that do that. There's only the trans-Tasman system, which actually has an interesting aspect. In 2003, they started moving towards a single market.
Yeah, just to
they
be clear,
use more
when I
harmonization.
say outlier, I'm not referring to recognition. I'm referring to the harmonisation for market access and the export of EU regulation a la REACH, a la GDPR.
That's actually, although actually even there, I'll get there later. I'll start with the mutual recognition point. There are only two systems doing that. The trans-Tasman system is now moving towards a single market. In fact, they have harmonization, and sometimes the harmonization looks rather uncomfortable. The food standard systems, for example, says the Australian system, the Australian-New Zealand food standard system will be based on an extension of the existing Australian system to New Zealand. So it was basically just, if you want, colonial expansion. And they have a common system now. And they are moving more towards harmonization. The EU system, interestingly, in 1985, if you read the white paper, which I would suggest everyone does, it's the British invention of the single market. And they already suggested moving towards more mutual recognition rather than harmonization. And that is actually how the single market works. But the way it works is rather interesting. And I think that shows the limits of getting into that system. The default EU rule is free movement of goods. So, mutual recognition of standards. If you want goods produced to UK standards, can just travel abroad. And then there are exceptions. Countries can stop the imports for certain reasons. And the reasons are in the treaty. And then you need a neutral agent that says, well, yeah, you're pretending to do that. But in reality, you're just imposing a trade barrier. And that neutral agent is the Court of Justice. So that model is unacceptable to us. But that also means if we get to an alternative model, where we say, well, you just have to recognize the standards, you'd have a stronger integrated system. And if the member states don't agree on a stronger system within themselves, they won't do it to the outside. So you'd have to come up with a model. And I honestly think so. I like the idea of going to that or developing such a system. And I think the EU is slightly more favorable because, as you said, sometimes on the outside there are bits and pieces, but it's really just very limited. And I think if you want to create such a new model, I think the large trading powers are unlikely to do that because, and the US is not behind the EU, they export their rules. And so, yeah.
Steve, you want to very quickly say something?
Just a tiny point. I'm not going to dispute the evolution of the single market. I'm just going to encourage anybody who's interested in what Margaret Thatcher thought about it to read her book Statecraft, which I did over Christmas. And she describes the evolution of her thinking about the single market in the European Union. And what she concludes, if I dare say it's just slightly disingenuous, because she says we should reform our relationship with the European Union, but she wanted to reform it so much that we could join NAFTA. So that's clearly leaving the European Union. So I just would say that while I wouldn't dispute the evolution of the single market at all, the person who took it through clearly came to reject it and think we'd given up too much.
Jonathan.
John Lisby from Brexit Central. During his opening remarks, Steve, loyal government backbencher as he is, recited what the Conservative Manifesto had said about aspirations in trade policy and having 8% of trade within 3 years done under free trade agreements and the various countries where parallel negotiations can be taking place. I wondered if the rest of the panel, in particular Shanker, who are less constrained by a party whip,
less constrained than Steve Baker, that's pretty bad.
Thought that those pledges were realistic or ambitious, and whether the Department of International Trade was fit and ready to deal with the volume and intensity of work that's upcoming.
Well, I think in terms of the manifesto commitments to concurrent negotiations, I think that's, they ought to be held to account on that. And if it looks like, again, the EU agreement is that we're getting this bifurcation and the EU agreement is going on one. I'm not suggesting that all the agreements have to move in parallel. What I'm suggesting is you start them at the same time. They will have different rhythms, and we'll see. You know, again, competition in all things. I think, as Bob Zellick you said when the FTAA broke down, the Free Trade Area of the Americas broke down, he said competitive liberalisation is going to be the goal. That's why he did all these bilaterals in Latin America. But I think competitive trade agreement negotiation by the UK is going to be important, and I think the government, you know, needs to keep on with that. In terms of the stretch goal of all the amount of trade that will be covered by trade deals, I would only say that there's a lot of stuff outside of trade deals that you need to be doing. There's a lot of mutual recognition agreements that you need to be doing. There's a lot of other stuff that is very, very important, and I think sometimes, you know, we tend to you know, talk only about trade deals, whereas actually there's a lot that we need to be doing in terms of removing the frictions in international trade generally, and also in terms of improving our own market. And that's to your question. I mean, the way to stop people moving is to have a very pro-competitive domestic regulatory market and to minimise the barriers as much as you possibly can. And I think in terms of the movement of firms, actually watch Northern Ireland. You know, Northern Ireland, I know that the Democratic Unionist Party was not very fond of the Northern Ireland Protocol, but I think you will find that land value in Northern Ireland will skyrocket because it is a great platform, and you will see a lot of firms moving. And the only other thing I'd add to Jonathan's point and to the point about the firm, yes, we must think about the firm and the impacts on the firm, but we also must think about the impact on consumers, and we also must talk about consumer welfare. A lot of my thinking is very predicated on what I've viewed as the direction of travel of European regulation over the last, 10 years, let's say. If it was going in a different direction, our analysis would be, quite different.
I'm just going to impose.
I wanted to agree with Shanker,
okay.
which is
We can't not have that.
I'm just going to impose a 3-line whip on answers, by which I mean 3 lines, no more, so we get one more question before the end.
Entirely agree with Shanker. It's not all about free trade agreements. If you look at the impact statement that the UK did for TTIP, an agreement with the US where you would think, oh God, that must be 15% of GDP. It was below 0.5%. And a lot of things can be done outside of these agreements that have an enormous impact and probably are not that sexy in the press.
Any more? Lady in the second row.
Thank you. Listener Clay. I wondered if I could pick up on a point that Holger raised. I think, if I understand it correctly, you were saying that there needs to be an injection of democracy into the trade negotiations so that the UK has built a consensus on what its objectives are on matters such as food standards, possibly data privacy. How, given the low level of political engagement of most people, can you practically do that? And do other members of the panel agree that having that consumer voice in the mix should be made a priority?
So I think there are several ways to do that, and I think one good example of creating internal consensus, of course it's a smaller country, is New Zealand, where you actually listen to people all over the country and try to inform the debate and build a consensus before you engage in enormous projects. One starting point is, of course, within the consultative bodies that are built up to have a consumer voice as well, rather than only industry voices, so that the government is also informed about effects that an agreement will have on consumers. So I think there are several things that can be done, and it is important in conceiving the infrastructure for negotiation that they are done.
Yeah, I don't want us to overthrow our constitution anymore. I want us to recover our constitution, make it work the way it should. So yes, of course we should consult with the public, but we are a representative democracy, not a direct democracy. I think that referendums have distinct limits. But what I would say is that I think it's 109, isn't it? New Conservative MPs are going to be very, very alert to the hundreds of emails turning up in their inbox about food standards or whatever it is. And I think our representative democracy will, in the end, exert a high degree of control over what happens. But I suppose the bottom line for me is we must do what we think is in the public interest, sit on the hot seat after we've done it. And that, in the end, is afraid how our democracy really works. But that's a long conversation. I'll come back and give a longer lecture on this one.
The only thing I'd say is you need parliamentary oversight of trade negotiations in general terms. It's a fine balance you have to have, because you at the same time don't want to be telling a trading partner that you've got to negotiate with Steve and 649 of his colleagues. You have to have some sort of mechanism where the executive can essentially do the negotiating, can negotiate the deal, bring it back, and then Parliament gets to vote up or down. Now, in the US, which I think is a system that works quite well in this regard, or used to work quite well in this regard, you have something called Trade Promotion Authority, used to be called Fast Track Trade Negotiating Authority. And essentially what it does is it enables the Congress to have some oversight, and the relevant congressional committees have oversight, but countries are not negotiating with members of Congress, and it comes back for an up or down vote. Now, because of the US system, and I recognise there are massive differences between the US system as it is now and a UK Parliament where you've got a majority of over 80, the USTR has to keep Congress on board because they could ultimately vote the deal down. So there has to be an extensive. Bob Lighthizer spends probably more time with the Democrats on the Hill than he does with the Republicans. So there is that process that we need to get set up. We need to have consultative committees and industry advisory committees to government. They need to be serious committees. We tend in the UK to have these sort of ad hoc things. They need to be serious, they need to be cleared advisors. In other words, they all need to sign the Official Secrets Act, and if they reveal what is revealed to them in negotiations, they go to jail. It's got to be very serious. And that is how the US system works. And it's very helpful to USTR to have that kind of industry input in real time. There's no point having industry input if they don't know what you're negotiating, so you have to give them some information. And some of those cleared advisory committees include consumer groups, they include labour groups, they include environmental groups as well. So you can construct that system, and I'm sure that's what the UK will be doing.
Thank you.
On remarks. Yes, very, very briefly. I mean, I think that I'd agree with the point made there that the low degree of engagement is a concern when as Steve mentioned, yes, this is a representative democracy, that's true. But actually, I think that given the need to prioritise in the negotiations which are immediately upon us, I think it's very likely that some of these things are very important for the futures, and I think also for the futures of the perhaps the young people in the country as well. If it's not represented, then to have a big backlash at the end of this parliamentary term, I think would be a thing that I would regret. I certainly think that more needs to be done to, as they say, reach out to the different constituencies, not just the electorate, but also the business community, and to, as you mentioned. And I don't see any big evidence of that, unfortunately.
Can I just say I'd regret a big backlash at the end of the Parliament too.
Yeah.
And the point I'm sure I said it, these new MPs in particular, me too, we will be very responsive to the correspondence that we get, and of course government will continue to consult. But that was the point I was making, is that we have mechanisms which work well within our representative democracy to take people's opinions as we go through a Parliament. And I hope you'll forgive me, Holger, I was sort of rejecting the idea that we needed to have a deeper kind of constitutional change, I think to your point, Alicia, to try and have a more participative democracy through this process, which I don't think we have got time to do, never mind any other factor.
That's not even what I meant.
Okay.
I meant public engagement also of the government, but also of Parliament, and the up and down vote. So I would be perfectly fine with that.
Thank you very much. I regret we have no more time for questions. I would like to end by thanking our panel tonight. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Holger. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Shanker. The event does not finish here. Drinks will still be served in the bar. And on your seat, as I mentioned earlier, you'll find a copy of Plan A+, which we invite you to take home and read at your leisure. Just please don't send your notes to the Charity Commission. Also on your seats, you will find this, which is a copy of the leaflet for the IEA Book Club. Exclusive invites, exclusive access, exclusive company, and for only £12, £16.50 a month, not only our fantastic catalogue of regulatory approved publications, but also events, such as tomorrow night's In Conversation with Neil Monnery, where he'll be discussing his latest book, A Tale of Two Economies, Hong Kong, Cuba, and the Two Men Who Shaped Them. Sign up tonight, and we'll see you tomorrow. Yeah. Finally, thank you to all of our donors who make events like this possible, and a big thank you to Pernod Ricard for providing the drinks this evening. Please do enjoy them. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you all.